Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. So today's free educational webinar from Homer Energy is on progress through the World Bank's Global Facility for Mini-Grids. I'm Marilyn Walker. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Homer Energy, and I'm excited to be with you here today. I'm really amazed watching who's coming on. We really have people from all over the world. And we really appreciate you showing up. We know it's all different time zones for us. We try to offer these free webinars monthly, and it's always particularly good when we can bring you direct access to speakers from outside Homer Energy, which is the case today. So our featured guest today is Jon Exel, leader of the World Bank's Global Facility on Mini-Grids, as well as the bank's task team lead of the $350 million Nigeria Electrification project, which finances one of the largest mini-grid portfolios targeting 850 mini-grids in Africa. Jon has a long track record of experience in this area, and I'm going to let him fill you in on the specifics of that. And then after Jon talks, we'll hear from Peter Lilienthal, CEO here at Homer Energy and creator of the Homer software. Peter will provide insights about the economics of mini-grids based on decades of Homer modeling. I also want to make sure everyone is aware that the Homer International Microgrid Conference is coming up soon, October 7th and 8th of this year. There's going to be a full-day training on Homer Pro immediately following the conference on October 9th. And this is absolutely the best place to learn how to use Homer. So we hope some of you can come join us at that. I also want to mention our partners, manufacturers, and service companies who've shown their dedication to and deep interest in distributed generation. Our current partners include Azimuth Energy, Enersys, Leonix, Spark Meter, Zant, and Studer. Thank you all for helping make these webinars possible. And now I'm going to hand the controls over to Jon Exel of the World Bank.
So thank you so much, Peter and Marilyn, for inviting me in this webinar. It's for us an exciting time because we just finished a very large and comprehensive study on mini grids, the role that mini grids can play, and also we looked into why mini grids. Is it a hype, or is there a reality behind it? And without revealing too much up front, but we have clearly moved away that this is not a hype, but there's strong economic reasons why we think that mini grids are moving in a direction of providing access to many people in Africa and developing Asia in order to reach universal access by 2030. So we have all started to document this in a report that was launched about a month ago at our annual learning event on mini-grids in Accra in Ghana. And you see here a picture of the cover of the photo with John Aqua. For people who were at our first learning event in Kenya, we visited one of the mini-grid sites there, and John Aqua was there welding its windows, a new business that he started because of the electricity that was provided by the mini grids. So what we have tried to do in our assessment is really to be as comprehensive as we could be. So we organized together with our sponsors and donors, in particular DFID, but also the host countries, organized 5 action learning events over the last years with a total of 2,000 participants. It almost doubled at each of the events. So a lot of the topics that we'll be discussing today were discussed at these events, and we took a lot of lessons from these sessions. We also at the bank have a quite extensive portfolio of mini-grid operations. And today that stands at 37 lending operations in countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar in Asia, and then Kenya and Nigeria in Africa as some of the flagship countries, and then Haiti. We're now also looking into large-scale deployment of mini-grids in Ethiopia and Ghana. We have worked on this report with a roster of experts, and we have basically selected these experts based on their experience with mini-grids in the field. And that means that they needed to have proven track record when it comes down to mini-grid related topics that they are an expert in. Long-winding, but what I meant to say is a regulator need to have worked on mini-grid regulations in some of our client countries. The same with a financier as well as a technology provider or a mini-grid developer. We did this with a lot of partnerships, including the Mini-Grid Developers Association of Africa, SNV, RMI, NREL, MIT, as well as Odyssey, Homer, and TTA and Incensus, just to name a few of our partners. I also don't want to forget Castalia, who really did a lot of the legwork in bringing the data for this report together. So we have, as part of the exercise, built up several databases, including the first comprehensive database, global database with 26,000, mini-grid projects around the world. This is a massive Excel spreadsheet with 26,000 lines of each of the individual mini-grid projects. We also looked at the programs that we are supporting in client countries and came away with 53 solar hybrid mini-grids, of which we have detailed costing information, and we brought that together and also looked into that in great detail. Then, for the first time around, we in 3 countries, in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Nepal, we actually did mini-grid operator surveys, and that's where we collected more data from more than 1,000 of these operators. And as mentioned, we have our mini-grid portfolio. So the report that is now launched is basically the executive summary. It's about 60 pages long, but the full report is about 500 pages. And we're not proud of producing a long and thick book, and that's also not how we see it. It's much more a reference document with clear, distinct chapters covering the individual frontiers and building blocks that we think are needed in order to have a successful program takeoff. And that means that we see that if there's a question on regulations, we can refer to Chapter 7. A question on access to finance, it can be Chapter 3. So rather than a thick book, it's much more a reference guide in that sense. We also have supporting annexes with country and case studies, video animations, as well as a dozen of presentations linking to these different topics. All of that we hope to make available this fall. As mentioned, the executive summary is already available online. At the end of the presentation, I'll show you a link where you can download it if interested. So basically, just to step back for a second, is that we have defined mini-grids as basically anything else than the main grid. I mean, that's how we talk about it here in the hallway. And that is moving away from some of the definitions that others are using in the past. So this would mean that a mini-grid can also provide electricity to towns and to cities, as long as these are not connected to the main grid. And we also have allowed for mini or microgrids that are connected to the main grid, but have the option to run in an isolated or islanded mode. So all of these power systems we have basically covered under the mini-grid definition. And the definition is further detailed in our book, and you see that here at the bottom of our screen. One thing that we also wanted to highlight is that mini-grids are not something new. as many of the high and medium income countries have seen, is that a national grid doesn't happen overnight. And in many cases, you have hubs of economic development zones where power systems are developed. And these systems expand when a national economy expands and grows. So we have here an example of the mini grids that existed almost a century ago in the US, but the same is true for the Netherlands, for the UK, for Spain, for Sweden, for China, and Brazil. Then what we have seen is that there's a second generation of mini grids, as we call them, and that was basically a set of mini grids around 2 or 3 decades ago, where you have micro hydro plants or diesel-fired plants in that are community-based, and they were led and owned by cooperatives and communities. In many cases, a lot of these systems became stranded assets because they were not having sufficient revenue in order to cover their operation and maintenance costs, as well as didn't have the technical designs to interconnect them to the main grid. Today, we see something completely different, and that is where a lot of the latest technological developments are now coming together in what we call the third generation of mini grids. I will go into some of the specifics a little later in the introduction in my presentation. So when we were looking at this at the sector, we saw that there's roughly 10 frontiers or 10 building blocks where we see a lot of movement has happened over the last years, and this ranges from innovative technologies being adopted, innovations when it comes down to national planning of energy systems, income generation, access to finance. So we really looked into all of these frontiers and tried to unravel if there was hype or if there was material change happening that would affect and is affecting the mini grid sector. So just to give a few examples to run you through this, is that on the technology side, looking at the database that we have, the 26,000, of which 19,000 are currently in operation and another 7,000 are planned for, and we clearly see there a shift from diesel and hydro powered systems to now a more and more solar and solar hybrid system. And that makes a lot of sense with the cost of solar PV as well as batteries, the cost of batteries coming down significantly. We also see an integration of a lot of disruptive technologies, if you wish. And that means that on the generation side, their hybridized system is now not just one signal technology that is providing the electricity, but it's now a combination of technologies. It's PV with batteries, with diesels, and in the past you couldn't control that in an affordable manner because the control system, the energy management systems were simply too expensive. But that has all come down, and these management systems can also be controlled remotely. So that's one batch of innovations that on the technology side we have seen. We also see that smart meters are now remote controlled smart meters are now also part of the equation, which helps with reducing the risk from a revenue perspective for the developer or the utility, as well as provides an overview or entry for the household from a transparency perspective. And then of course there's a massive development when it comes down to the appliances. The efficiency gains that have been made over the last 3 to 5 years are ranging between 30 and 60%. And that means literally to the bottom line of the design of these systems, and that there's a 30 to 60% reduction in the cost of the investments, and that has a direct relationship, obviously, to the retail tariff and the affordability of the tariff for the end user. So those are kind of the game changers that we're seeing when it comes down to third generation and the technology that is being adopted. So on the planning side, also there we have seen massive changes when it comes down to, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, where on a national level, this can now be done with geospatial tools. And we're not only focusing now anymore on, okay, what is the last pole of the distribution network of the utility? And we extend it for the next 5 or 10 kilometers, and that is our master plan for electrification. There's now the possibility to really do an in-depth analysis and do a least cost assessment of where grid extension, where mini grids, and where off-grid individual solar systems make the best sense for the public dollar that is being invested. And these things are comprehensive and can be done relatively quickly at low cost. And the same we're now seeing for in the mini grid area. So the tools are now available to basically use geospatial and publicly open source data to bring together all the necessary information that you want to know for the load centers: population density, schools, clinics, small medium enterprises, farming activities, etc. And based on that, from behind your desk, you can now make an assessment, not just of 1 or 2 projects, but for the whole country, covering maybe like Nigeria, tens of thousands of potential sites, and then prioritizing them on economic parameters of where it makes most sense to develop a portfolio of mini grids. And that is useful for governments in order to think about where to use their scarce public resources, but also for the private sector that wants to tap into these economies of scale that are out there. So we're piloting this now in several countries, and in particular in Nigeria, where we're working very closely with the Rural Electrification Agency, as well as the private sector and these tool developers in bringing this all together. And in that sense, we're testing, we're kicking the tires of the system, so to say. And maybe as a last is that when we compare the costing per site, is that in a traditional fashion, it's about $30,000 to $40,000 per site, with multidisciplinary teams going out to each site, to now about $3,000 per site. That's a magnitude change in the costing when it comes down to preparation. So on mini grid regulations, we now know that there's 5 key topics that need to be addressed, from market entry to retail tariff, but also what happens when the main grid arrives. And we have looked at the 6 countries that now have these kind of mini grid regulations in place, and we have compared it. And what we have tried to do is not to come up with best practices, but much more looking at how can different countries make use of these lessons from other countries. And so we've come up with decision trees where governments, regulators, decision makers can look at what are the parameters, the inputs that they have in their specific country context, and based on that see what the options are in order to regulate the mini grid sector. And that can be, in some cases, it can come from a uniform tariff to cost reflective tariffs, and what are the implications for that. At the end of the day, what we're hoping to achieve, that there are informed decisions that are being made by these key decision makers. So obviously, mini grids and the mini grid sector evolves over time. But what we have seen in the past is that the regulations, associated regulations, don't evolve over time. And we saw from an example in Cambodia that with a very involved regulator, once you do evolve the regulations over time, you have a better chance of getting the mini grid sector growing. You don't want to overregulate it early on when a lot of uncertainty is in the market, when there's no cohort of mini grid developers active. So you want to make it easy for these companies to come in. Later on, when the sector has been established and start to show some signs of monopolistic behavior, then some more regulated actions might be better suited. So another example is the database technology platforms. As mentioned, for Nigeria, we're working there closely to bring all of that data together, and Odyssey is there the leader in this sector, and it's a great example of where today you can now bring all this information together, and Homer is also part of these tools to now, with all this market intelligence that you have, that you can run that through these tools to help you make optimum designs, as well as look what are the best projects from a rate of return perspective. Again, from a private sector perspective, but also from a public sector perspective. And in Nigeria, we're working with the government to set up a tender for minimum subsidy around this platform. So we also looked into the viability, as mentioned, of the mini grids. Is it hype or is there reality behind it? And one thing that we learned is that there is reality behind it, but it is very, very important that that the designers, that the companies, that the regulators, that the rural electrification agencies are aware of how these systems can be designed in a financial sustainable manner. And this is where productive uses and income generating use of electricity play a major role. And this graph shows that with low load factors, the LCOE, the cost reflective tariff, basically is 55 cents per kilowatt hour at a load factor of 22%. If the load factor goes up to 80%, in the case where, for example, you have irrigation, you have storage for water, you have maybe some key anchor customers, then the LCA comes down to 35 cents per kilowatt hour. So for us, it's really important as part of the design, and also to remind people and reiterate that this needs to be an integral part of mini grid development, mini grid design. For us, mini grid equates to productive uses and income generation. So does that happen automatically? And that's also what we found. It doesn't. There are quite a few mini grid projects out there with very low load factors, basically having domestic uses, 1 or 2 light bulbs, today LED light bulbs of 2 or 3 watts each, being the customers of a mini grid, making these mini grids very unsustainable in the medium and long run. At the same time, we have seen that mini grids where this is incorporated, that it doesn't happen automatically. There needs to be a full realization that a lot of these communities have for decades, if not centuries, lived and developed their culture and social dynamics without electricity. And now they're going to move from that established way of living into a way of living with electricity. And that requires a lot of training, capacity building, awareness creation. And here's this table just shows some of the examples of that it does make a lot of economic sense for people in these load centers to adopt these appliances with payback times of less than a year in this case. At the same time, we see also that this requires investments, and these investments are many times relatively small from an international perspective, but from a local perspective, it's not what is available. So some kind of financing needs to come in play as well. So either through the electricity provider, through a payment scheme, through their bills, or having a partnership with microfinance institutions. So this is from one of our programs in Bangladesh, where it shows that this lower uptake of demand started to change when ITCOL, the program manager, started to provide awareness campaigns. And this led to almost 2 to 3 times faster uptake of demand based on these awareness. So just to highlight that we also looked at the private sector, we collected audited financial statements of some of the lead companies in the sector and compared that to other service delivery organizations, some of the larger utilities, as well as distributed renewable energy suppliers, and compared that. I will not go into detail here, just to keep an eye on the clock. But just to mention that that's in the report. We also looked at what the potential is for profit of along the value chain, and we see clearly that solar PV suppliers and storage are leading the way there, and that most likely the generator sets will be phased out over the next decade or so. This is, as I mentioned, just to give you a quick feel of the results that we picked up out of the operator surveys that we did in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Nepal. And to remind us that if we can bring all of these different frontiers together on a country-specific dimension, then there's a good chance for the mini-grid sector to take off. So I don't want to make this too long, but just to highlight that on the costing side, things have really changed. And what we have seen today is that it's about 55 cents per kilowatt hour, but that is with very low load factors of about 22%. If load factors, look a project with load factors of 40%, it's 42 cents. But if we look at the expected cost reductions of solar, PV, batteries, and other technologies, as well as the adoption of higher load factors into the mini grids, then we're looking about 22 to 20 cents per kilowatt hours by 2030. So just to also give you a quick insight into a comparison that we did to the public funding that can be utilized. I mean, there's no country in the world that has reached universal access without public funding. So in this case, we looked at what if you would use public funding to subsidize maybe 40 to 60% of the capex, which comes down to $300 to $800 per connections, which is similar to what you see, or even lower to what you see national utilities in many of the African countries are using. Then with today's cost structure, these tariffs would come down to around 34 to 31 cents per kilowatt hour, which makes it significantly more affordable into the markets that we're working. So this graph is in the book as well. We compared it quickly. There's a study done at ESMAP where we looked at what are the cost reflective tariffs that national utilities need to charge today in African country in order to cover their costs. And so these are not the retail tariffs, which are subsidized, but what are the cost reflective tariffs of these utilities? And we can see that they range from high 60s to somewhere in below the 10 cents per kilowatt hour. But if we would project the cost reductions of mini grids along the same line, then you can see with 20 cents per kilowatt hour, mini grids will become competitive to 27 of the 39 utilities. At the same time, we're clearly see this as a win-win for the utility and the mini grid developer. Because of the cost reductions, these systems, the mini grids, can now be built according to grid standards, 24/7 high reliability of electricity provision, as well as have a distribution network that is grid code, built according to grid code. That once the grid arrives, it's a very straightforward technical possibility to interconnect them. At the same time, mini grids, because of the need to be viable and the need to develop productive load, it helps with the development of load and affordability for once the main grid arrives. So in that sense, it becomes a much more viable proposition for the national utilities to compare to going into a rural area where none of this has been done before. So for us to look forward is that in order to make things happen, there are basically 5 key areas where we see that maybe as a sector we can challenge ourselves. One is the pace. Is we need to move away from individual pilot projects, 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 on a country by country basis. But we need to move into a portfolio approach, which we're seeing in different countries. But to hundreds of projects by 2025 and more than 1,500 projects per country per year by 2030. We think it's very important that the current quality that these third generation mini grids, as reflected by the members in the African Mini Grid Developers Association, that they keep the quality of service at the current 97% of uptime on an annual basis. This creates credibility, and in that sense, it's a true value for money from an end user's perspective. We also think that we need to keep on remembering ourselves and re-emphasize that the load factor is of critical importance, and that as an industry, we should maybe aim for 45% to achieve this. Then on the business environment, we have set targets along the lines with our regulatory indicators for sustainable energy, where we have a specific section on mini grids, on financing to really have the leveraging between development partners and the private sector to get to the funds that are needed, and that's $220 billion by 2030. And a massive amount of investment is needed, but we have seen that before in, for example, the off-grid solar sector, that once the sector gets going, the investment is available to keep growing. And last but not least, part because of all these other aspects, is to help to bring the cost down to about 20 cents per kilowatt hour, making it a true value proposition in the marketplace. So based on that, we can see, we projected this out and compared it with some of the other scenarios that about 490 million people are able to have access to electricity through mini grids by 2030, and that it's not just a hype or a pipe dream, but that there's real changes and momentum behind the sector that makes it a major challenge, but it's possible to achieve this. So let me stop here. This is where you can reach me if you have questions. This is also the link to the report. You can also just type it in Google, mini grids for 500 million people, and it will lead you there immediately. So let me stop here, and I hope and look forward to your questions and the discussion around it. So thanks again for having me and letting me share our experience and findings with all of you.
Great, thanks, John. So while I switch presenters here.
Okay, well, thank you, John, and thank you, Marilyn, and thank you all for joining. I'm going to follow up his presentation with a short presentation on the economics of energy access mini grids. I'd like to start by setting the stage a little bit because we're in the middle of a global transition from centralized utility structure based on big polluting fossil plants to a clean distributed future based on solar and storage primarily. Because of huge technology improvements in solar and storage that John alluded to, and also in electronics, communications, and control. Those are inherently distributed or decentralized or modular technologies, and that erases the advantage that centralized plants have always had with thermal technologies, which is what's driven the structure of the existing utility industry. This is true across the globe, but it's especially true in developing countries. So we've looked at microgrids and mini grids from a lot of different perspectives. And in the US, the interest is mostly about reliability. But for this presentation, we're focusing on energy access, which is really about economics, about providing power at a cost that people can afford. And so efficient design is really important with that. That's really changed now with diesel becoming more expensive and solar and storage becoming less expensive. Eventually, we think emissions is the biggest driver in the long run. But right now, we're focusing on how to create cost-effective, economical, energy cost-saving mini grids. So there's three real challenges that I want to focus on. One has to do with tariff structures, which John alluded to. The grid expansion, which John also alluded to, and the system design. So tariffs are super important. I can't overemphasize how important they are. And mini grids are different. The cost structure of mini grids is different than the cost structure of a centralized system. And so the tariff structure should be different. And one of the main differences is that in a mini grid with that's got a higher proportion of reliance on solar or wind for that matter, you're going to have periods when there's excess energy, which gets curtailed. So during those periods, you can basically give away the energy, frankly, and this is every sunny afternoons. Typically, there'll be excess energy. So daytime energy is really inexpensive to provide, and that's was shown in John's slides about how improving the load factor, which usually means increasing daytime energy, really helps bring the cost down. So the tariff structure should reflect that. And water pumping is sort of a special case because you can be really flexible about when to provide it. It's just cheaper to store water than to store electricity. And so you can pump the water when the sun shines and turn it off when the sun doesn't shine. And that makes the whole system much more efficient and actually reduces cost for everybody. So that should also be reflected in special tariffs for water pumping. On the other hand, power that requires you to turn on a backup generator, that's expensive power. And so there's a lot of different ways. I'm not going to get into the details but time of use rates is one. You can even get more fancier than that. But this is very different than a flat kilowatt hour rate that is typical in a centralized system. The other big problem that it needs to be thought about when you're looking at tariff structures has to do with the way they're subsidized, because power is energy of all kinds really is subsidized all over the world, and the structure of that subsidy really matters. So if you're just lowering the cents per kilowatt hour to the customer, you're creating three problems. One, you're discouraging energy efficiency. So with cheap power, people will buy incandescent lamps, and they'll buy secondhand refrigerators, which are real energy hogs. Whereas if they're paying the real cost of power, LED lights are a no-brainer. And there's a lot of refrigerators out there now that are extremely efficient, but they cost more. So you have to have an incentive, a program to promote those. And cheap cents per kilowatt hour tariffs undercut that energy efficiency. Also, if you're just subsidizing kilowatt hours, as people start using more kilowatt hours and the economy is growing, whatever, you're connecting more people, you're just increasing the fiscal burden on the government to provide that subsidy in sort of an unbounded way. And in some countries, this has become a huge problem. And so a smart subsidy structure would find a way to limit that. And typically, the rationale for the subsidies is to help the lower income people. So it should be targeted to the lower income people. And so just subsidizing, just providing low cents per kilowatt hour means that the majority of the subsidy goes to the wealthier people who buy more appliances and buy more energy. So it sort of defeats the social purpose behind the subsidies. So the solution to that is what's in some places called the Lifeline rates. There's lots of different names for it, but you limit the subsidy to small amounts of consumption. So in the little graph I've got there, just one example, for $5 a month, that's less than people pay for kerosene and cell phone charging. And it's a flat fee, $5 a month, you get 10 kilowatt hours. In this example, you know, everybody could set these thresholds and prices a little differently, but that's more than enough for a few LEDs and cell phone charging in a small household. And that also kind of corresponds to, depends how the system is designed, but corresponds to the solar production, which has very low operating costs. And so if everybody uses small amounts of power, you don't really need a backup generator. But the larger consumers who are using more power and are requiring the use of a backup generator and the purchase of diesel fuel, et cetera, they should be paying full cost recovery of the diesel cost. So you can charge more for the higher levels of consumption and charge less for the lower levels of consumption. That's the whole idea behind a Lifeline rate, and it does limit the subsidy going forward. It preserves the incentive for energy efficiency, and it focuses on the lower income people. So I'm a big fan of these Lifeline rates, and I think it's even more appropriate in the mini grid sector. So the second thing that I want to point out is this idea that we're all waiting for the grid, waiting for Godot, waiting for the grid, and there's a lot of communities out there that are where it's difficult to develop a mini grid because they're saying, well, the utility tells us the grid's going to come sometime, the main grid, and we have to change that mindset because that's it's a real obstacle to investors who are worried about a stranded asset, but also it's just the wrong way to think about mini grids. It's sort of thinking of them as kind of a stopgap measure, but they're really not. Well designed, a mini grid can have better power than the centralized grid, and we're seeing that now in the U.S. where places that really care about power quality and about reliability and resilience are building mini grids because you just can't provide power with overhead lines stretching across the countryside in a really reliable way. So mini grids actually, a well-built mini grid, that community probably doesn't even want the grid once they've shown that the mini grid is reliable. And so it's a change in mindset to think about solar is not competing with coal. Solar is competing with copper. It's actually cheaper to build a mini grid, let's say a 100 kilowatt mini grid is cheaper than 20 kilometers of grid extension, and it's more reliable. It's actually even true on the other side, which is bad for mini grids, I suppose, where solar home systems are cheaper than a grid extension from a mini grid if it's just a really small consumer that just wants 3 LEDs, let's say, and a cell phone. A solar home system to provide that power is cheaper than just 100 feet of copper for a grid extension. So it's a whole new way of thinking about this sector. And the final thought I want to leave you with on this is that if the centralized utility is not providing good service to its existing customers, it shouldn't be trying to add new customers. And in many parts of the world, the centralized utilities aren't providing quality, stable, reliable power. And they should fix that problem and let the mini grids worry about connecting new customers. So the third challenge that is on the system design topic. There's just too many choices, lots of existing old technology, new technology. Everybody wants to know what's best. Unfortunately, there's no cookie cutter, one size fits all solution. The answer is really it depends, and excuse me, it depends on what are the resources available in that area. It depends on what do you need energy for, just both the reliability requirement, but also load profiles daily and seasonally, et cetera. And the technology keeps changing. It's getting better, so that's good. But that just adds to confusion. Excuse me. And a confused mind says no. So our job here at Homer Energy is to help people fit those pieces together. And we've been doing this for over 25 years. First at NREL, but 10 years ago we formed Homer Energy. At this point, over 200,000 people have used Homer, modeling over 70,000 projects. You can see the geographic distribution there. Over 100,000 people get our newsletter. I think everybody on the webinar here probably does get our newsletter. And we've got over 3 million files, which we're going to be working with the World Bank to mine that data for information about what people are looking at for mini grids around the world. So just a quick little overview, very high level on what a Homer is. You got to talk about what the load profile is. You need the resources. I've already described the inputs. It does a full simulation chronologically, hour by hour or minute by minute for a year or a whole project life, however you want to do it. How much fuel you're going to use, when are you going to charge and discharge the batteries, et cetera, how long are they going to last. Does that for hundreds of different systems and finds the least cost system. And then you can do sensitivity analysis around that to identify how robust it is. And of course, tells you your return on investment, how much fuel you're going to use. You can look at hourly results. There's lots of data that comes out of that. And so I'll just stick to that for now. So we talk to renewable advocates around the world. We talk to utility operators. These folks are like night and day, or Mars and Venus. We talk to power engineers who have very sophisticated engineering models that don't consider economics. We talk to the finance community that have sophisticated spreadsheets that don't consider any of the technical issues. And we sit in the middle. And the goal here is to have a tool everybody can use together, sit around a table and come to some agreement. You're not going to get a project built unless all these different groups, which are very different, have a common vision. And so we've given them a common tool, and we believe software can be a great communication tool. So I'm going to end with that. Just mention leave this last slide. You can read on your own about what other people have said, and wrap up my part and pass it back to Marilyn for questions.
Thanks, Peter. So we have some great questions, and not a lot of time, so I'm going to sort of pick out the very best ones. A lot of people are asking about the presentations themselves, and we can certainly share Peter's presentation, and I'm pretty sure Jon said we could share his too. So we do not have those ready to share for you yet. We'll have to turn them into PDFs, but we will put them up on a website and let you know where that is. Okay, so let's dive into the others. Jon, can you talk about finding investors for mini grids?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we're seeing is that from the World Bank, we have now 37 operations in 30 plus countries. So that means that and a total of $600 million allocated and approved by our board for financing of mini grid projects and mini grid developers in many cases. So I think one is that it would be good if somebody has specific questions around that please feel free to contact me, and then we can see if we can line you up with the respective what we call task team leader for the country that you're working in. So I think that's one, is that there's more funding out there, certainly from our perspective, than many people know. know of. So please feel free to contact me on that, on what we are doing. Then secondly is that there's a cohort of commercial investors that are now looking into the sector. And recently there were about 12 who came out that they're looking into the sector to deploy about $2 billion in combination with the industry, government, as well as result-based financing programs, as they said. So those are out there, and I think that's another avenue where some of the developers can tap into this financing. We're trying to make that easier accessible, these commercial financing, but we're not yet there. So I think this is without knowing the specific background of where this question is coming from. Maybe this is the best what I can do at this point.
Thanks. And I'm going to take this time to give a little advertisement that the upcoming conference that we're having, part of the reason that we do that every year and really get people together is so that you can come and talk to people. And Jon and Peter will both be keynote speakers there. So I just wanted to say that. Okay, let's see. Jon, another question is about the full report. Someone said the World Bank report is only an executive summary. Is that correct? Is there a different version of it?
No, that's correct. So the executive summary has been launched now, and the full report, we plan to make that available in fall. So September, October of this year. We're basically going through the final editing and formatting on our end. So please be patient on that, but September, October.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, I'm not sure I understand this question, but I'm going to ask it. Maybe you guys do. What should be the best expansion strategy if mini grids are overloaded within 2 years? So maybe the person, yeah.
I'll jump in really quickly.
Yeah.
If it depends, mini grids come in so many different flavors, but if you've got a backup generator, what overloaded ends up meaning is you're using the backup generator more than you wanted to, or you initially intended to, which means you're using more diesel fuel. So adding solar and storage would reduce the diesel fuel consumption. So presumably, I mean, if you do the Lifeline tariffs like I was suggesting, the savings in diesel fuel should pay for the addition of additional solar and storage. It's a little tricky with having old batteries and new batteries. They need their own separate controllers. So it's not, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but those are modular technologies, and that's one of the beauties of it, is that you can add new capacity in a modular fashion, which commercial projects really should be doing. A lot of grant funded projects are like, well, we don't want to have to go back, so we're going to overbuild it in the beginning so we don't have to go back because we have money now and we don't know if we'll have money in the future. And that makes sense for grant projects, but it doesn't really make sense for commercial projects.
Okay, thanks. Jon, a question for you. Did you look at Asian microgrid case studies, or was it just Africa?
No, actually we looked globally. So we worked with Navigant and with Bloomberg to collect all the data, and also to some of the programs that we're supporting in Asia. And actually, most of the projects that are currently in operation are in Asia. And one of the lessons that we learned was a lot of the activities that are ongoing in Africa. It's almost like there is reinvention of the wheel there, and maybe we should have more exchange with Asia to learn what they have done there. So it's both Asia and Africa.
Okay. And another one for you, John, on Odyssey. It says, is the bank microgrid facility working with Odyssey? And if so, can you describe how that program is or will be working?
Yeah, so we're working very closely with Odyssey in some of our programs in the countries, and the best example is Nigeria, where really we are together with the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, have collected data, detailed data for 57 sites. There's now data collection ongoing for another 400 sites, and all that data is now uploaded in, or for the 57 sites have already been uploaded in Odyssey, and the others will be coming. Allowing the developers, but also the country to look at the load duration curve and the composition of these load centers, etc. And so that's ongoing. And through Odyssey, we're now also launching the tender for the minimum subsidy per connection program. As well as our administrating the performance grant, $350 per connection for the mini grids in Nigeria. So we have a very close relationship with the Rural Electrification Agency, Odyssey, and ourselves in order to make the platform as user-friendly as possible, and really trying to get to a stage where it can be used in other countries and other programs as well.
Great, thank you. I want to say, for those of you who don't know, so Odyssey is an online platform, and it does use sort of a simplified version of Homer so that you can hook directly into Homer, and then for a later stage you do need to use Homer Pro, but it actually is an integrated platform with a simple version of Homer for assessment. Okay, so Peter, there's a question for you here, and this is related to your too many choices tool. So there's not only too many choices, but the costs and the technology changes over time. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's, as I said, that's one of the factors that has added confusion to, but it's a good factor because those technology changes are all improvements. So there's sort of two separate issues. Is you know, when you make a decision, you want to make a decision based on what you've got available at the moment. And if new technology comes along later, well, that's great. But you wanted the project should be cost effective based on what you have when you make them, when you develop the project. I wouldn't, if a project looks cost effective today, it really doesn't matter what new technology is coming down the pike later. And frankly, you know, the technology is really improving, but there's a huge amount of people out there, companies out there, developing stuff that they say is going to be ready next year, and who knows when it's really going to be ready. So I resist the idea that, well, we should just wait till the technology improves. It's really, it is improving, but and the question is, based on what's available today, does this project make sense? There's all kinds of crazy ideas about what we could do in the future, but let's wait for the future to do those. Well, that's not the best way to say that, but I hope that answered the question well. Marilyn, I'm gonna take a minute here to answer another question I happen to notice asking about carbon credits, and put in a plug for Micro Energy Credits is a company that is using carbon credits to finance small scale renewables. So you should all look up Micro Energy Credits. Favorite little company of mine.
Okay, and yeah, I also want to say I see a lot of questions about, are you considering this technology or that technology? And so, you know, the World Bank is financing these things, but you can use Homer to really investigate those technologies. So So that's why we have both Homer and the World Bank on the line today here to really talk about that. And we're over time. I hope Jon can just answer one more question, and then I'm going to call it to an end. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of your questions, but it's about business models. Is there, how do we deal with business models? Is there sort of a single case or set of business models templates for implementing these mini grids in low-income communities?
No, I think there's no one size fits all. I think if you look at, for example, China, it was very much municipality-driven mini grid model. If you look at some of the medium and high income countries, I know in the Netherlands it was a lot owned by the public sector around cities. In other cases in the US, there were cooperatives that really run the mini grids. In Cambodia, it was very much driven by the private sector. After the Pol Pot regime came down and people had to fend for themselves, and so it became a private sector commercial environment. Myanmar is to that extent today very similar, private sector led. We see now in Kenya that there is a combination of going on. In one hand, there's the private sector expanding the mini grid sector, as well as the utilities, who are now also seeing that from their costing perspective, that mini grids are making sense in a remote area. So there, the government and the World Bank and partners are trying to have some kind of a public-private partnership approach where utility continues to own the clients, but the private sector basically provides the system and operates it. Nigeria is an example where it's very much private sector led, but with some kind of performance-based grants coming in from the public sector in order to make it viable. So there's no one size fits all. But I think the overall message is that because of the cost reductions and the ability to now start delivering at scale through portfolios, etc., that there are different business models out there to make it work.
Great. Well, thank you, Jon. And I've never seen so many compliments on a webinar. People are writing in and just really appreciate your time. So of course, this is all incredibly important. And thank you, and thanks thank you, Jon and Peter and everyone who came on today. And we're going to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. And goodbye to all the attendees. We really appreciate your interest.